Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. So here we are starting Unit 7, the unit on evolution. So Chapter 22 is really just an intro chapter, giving you some context for a lot of stuff you probably already know. Um, I will go through the lecture again. Some of this is just sort of background story, but there are parts that are really key to know. So I'll sort of point out the stuff and make sure you get this down. Okay. So, first, we want to think about what evolution is. Evolution is a change in a population over time. And the idea is the population changes because some organisms survive and some don't. Sorry about that. It's a little gruesome. But chapter 22 sort of looks at this process where people figured out, okay, what is evolution and how does it work, at least in part. So 1860s, Darwin had looked at publishing his book on evolution. Now, up to that point, the idea of natural history is that the Earth was young, less than 6,000 years old, and that life that was on the Earth was not subject to any sort of change. Okay, so the Earth was young and unchanging, was again the prevailing notion in natural history at the time. Now, in this time period or in this sort of framework of understanding nature, Charles Darwin came up in this prominent family, but he wasn't super interested in sort of following some of the family pursuits. So he went into the seminary to become a priest, decided he didn't like that. So then he dropped out and got a job through his family as a naturalist on board this ship that was going to do some mapping of the coastline of South America. Okay, so the Beagle was going to travel around the world and spend a lot of time, again, sort of mapping the coastline of South America. And Darwin's job was to go make sketches and bring back samples of the different plant and animal life that he encountered on the trip. Okay, now, you got to imagine if you're spending a few years on a boat, you're going to have some time to take in information. So he did quite a bit of reading, and there were some individuals that had a lot of influence on Darwin's ideas that he ended up putting into his explanation for evolution. One such person was Thomas Malthus. I think Malthus as Mr. Doom and Gloom. The point Malthus was an economist, and the point he made is that populations have the capacity to grow exponentially. And this is something to definitely record. Malthus said, okay, populations can have this constant growth rate or this exponential growth rate. And the idea with exponential growth is that at some point you hit an inflection point and then numbers really take off. Okay. But he said this typically doesn't happen because of competition. So competition for limited resources can increase death rates, decrease birth rates, and then that sort of levels off population growth. So again, Malthus is Mr. Doom and Gloom because he's saying populations won't continue to grow exponentially forever because they're going to run out of food or they're going to start competing for resources, and that will lead to problems. So you think about Earth's population. We've been in a period of exponential growth for the past couple thousand years, but in 1980, I think the Earth hit 4 billion people, and then by around the year 2000, we hit 6 billion people. Now we're up to more than 7.5 billion people. So again, interesting ideas related to that. We'll talk more in the ecology unit. All right, here's another individual who influenced Darwin, and the concept is something you definitely want to know. It's uniformitarianism. Now, again, the idea at the time is that the Earth was really young, just a handful, thousands of years old, less than 10,000 years old. But Lyell was like, billions. Okay, the Earth is billions of years old. And the point he made is that processes that shaped the Earth billions of years ago still shape the Earth now. So think about erosion, think about movement of tectonic plates, think about volcanic eruption. All those forces that sort of alter the environment have been going on for a long, long time. Now, that ends up being important for Darwin because what it does is it gives time for populations to change. So again, if the initial idea was that the Earth was young and life was unchanging, well, then there's no way for life to have the capacity to evolve, right? Because there's not the time for it. But Lyle said the Earth has been around a long time and it's been changing for a long time. And so that processes that shape the Earth give opportunity for life to evolve. Let's see. Now, one other idea that was sort of helpful or at least opened doors for Darwin was the evolutionary theory of, or evolutionary hypothesis of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Now, Lamarck said, you know what? Life does evolve. Life does change over time. But he needed a mechanism for that. He needed to explain how that happened. So Lamarck developed the idea of acquired characteristics. Now, you can sort of put a pin in acquired characteristics because you can think of it as an explanation for how populations evolved. It's false. It doesn't work. What Lamarck discussed was this idea of use and disuse, that over the course of an organism's lifetime, by trying to do different things, it can actually change its phenotype or change its characteristics and then pass those on to offspring. His sort of classic example of that is that the way giraffes got long necks is that over time, in order to reach vegetation at the tops of trees, giraffes stretched their necks. And then those that were able to stretch their necks survive and pass on the long neck trait to their offspring. Okay, that's like saying if Arnold Schwarzenegger gets all pumped up, he's going to have like muscly babies, right? We know that it doesn't work, right? So Lamarck was way off base in terms of explaining how evolution occurs, because what Lamarck did was he treated evolution as an individual phenomenon, that like individuals could evolve. And in reality, individuals do not evolve. It's the population, right? It's the population that changes over time. All right, so Darwin, again, he was able to circumnavigate the world, but there was one place that had sort of an outsized impact on him. So they're bopping along the coastline of South America, and they spent, I want to say it was like 2 or 3 weeks at the Galapagos Islands. It's maybe 600 miles off the west coast of South America. And it's a relatively young group of islands. I think it's on the order of like 5 to 7 million years old. And it's sort of wild because it's separated from the mainland. It's sort of close, but it's not like it's out in the middle of the ocean. So there's some connection to the mainland. It's relatively young. And within this cluster of islands, the islands themselves have vastly different environments. Some are mountainous with like rainforests. Some are really low to the ground and desert-like and just like bare rock. You have inland lakes with seawater, so that you have saltwater lakes on some of these islands. So it's really diverse terrain, really diverse life. And so Darwin traveled around to these islands that were all clustered together, but were really unique. And what he had noticed is, gosh, you have these organisms that resemble some of the stuff from mainland South America, but have some differences. Additionally, when you look at these populations of organisms on their particular islands, they're all uniquely suited for their particular habitats. So it's where he sort of has his aha moment where it's like, gosh, all these organisms are so well suited to their highly specific environments that evolution must have occurred to help them become better adapted. All right, so let's look at some examples here. We have looked at flightless cormorants before. Again, these are birds related to other cormorants, but they can't fly. They've got these little vestigial wings. They got these scraggly wings that aren't good for flight, but these birds are really good at diving down to the water. Here we got a little cormorant video.
This afternoon we are on the island of Fernandina and Punta Espinosa.
Check out what the islands are like as well. So these cormorants
here in the Galapagos are unique, and they are only found in this region, just on the western side of Isabela and Fernandina. What do you like the most about the cormorants? Their little wings. Their little wings, okay? What else? Cormorants are not the most graceful birds. However, the beautiful green eyes make one of the most challenging pictures to take for photographers. In order to be successful fishers, they have to increase their body mass, larger feet, and heavier dense fur. Doesn't even look like feathers, it's more like a fur, like a sea lion. They can remain underwater, and with an elongated neck, they can give a lot of directions and chase the fish easily. I love the flightless comrades with their tiny little wings. I love their adaptation to the land of which we sing.
All right. Well, hey, there you go. A little something extra. So yeah, again, well suited for. Hold on, look out! Oh, it is wonderful. Excuse me. So yeah, sort of fascinating to look at how those birds are. Again, that what you find them on one side of a couple of islands. So it sort of gives you the idea of just how sort of niche they are in their habitats. I'm sorry, when you watch these videos, it pops you out. I got to sort of reset the presentation. Okay, those are the cormorants. Here, another species of birds. You got red and blue-footed boobies. Now, these birds have very distinct feet, right? But what's interesting is that where they nest differs. The red-footed boobies nest in trees, and the blue-footed boobies nest on the ground. So they nest in different locations, and that prevents breeding between the groups, and that has allowed them to acquire these adaptations that make them different groups. The Galapagos are sort of fascinating because you have 3 different ocean currents coming in from the west, the south, and the north. So you get really cool ocean water and warm ocean water all intermixing at this one location. So again, it's this real hub of biodiversity at the Galapagos, in part because all these different ocean currents converge. So you're at the equator, but you still wind up with penguins. So a wild place. Marine iguanas, we looked at those a little bit last semester when we looked at osmoregulation. Here you have lizards that go and munch on the plant material underwater. And again, sort of wild because they've got glands that allow them to express or squirt out really highly concentrated saline solution to help them control their salt water balance inside their bodies. Another organism that Darwin wrote about quite a bit were these giant tortoises. There are actually some tortoises still alive today that were around back when Darwin was there, or at least when he was writing his books. But these tortoises, the guide that was going around and showing him the different islands had told him that you could tell the island that the tortoises came from by the shapes of their shells. And what Darwin again learned was that the shells sort of matched the environmental demands of the islands. So the shells have just sort of a straight dome or a flattened dome. Those tortoises get their food from vegetation that's on the ground. Here you see a larger hump in the shell, and for these tortoises, the vegetation they consume is higher up off the ground. So again, the tortoises are all different and adapted for the particular islands in which they live. All right, Darwin collected quite a few birds in his travels, and when he was at the Galapagos, he grabbed a number of different birds that ended up being of different species. Sort of the evolutionary history of these birds has been something that people have pursued or tried to find for quite a bit of time. And what they found is, once you look at the DNA of these birds, they're descended from birds from Central America that moved down to South America and then probably got blown during maybe a storm over to the Galapagos. Again, looking at the different birds, What he had found is that the birds have beaks that are uniquely suited for the types of foods on the different islands. So on the different islands, you have different terrains, different microclimates, and that allows for different types of vegetation to live on the different islands. And the birds have beaks that are particularly well suited for the food sources on those different islands. So, Darwin sees all this stuff in one little place and is like, gosh, what is happening to allow these populations to be so well suited for their environments? Now, again, context of the time, this is something that would have gone directly against what people had accepted as our understanding of how life began, that life was young and unchanging. So Darwin, again, comes from sort of a prominent family, had given some talks to royal societies and stuff like that, and had been sort of shouted down. People didn't want to hear his ideas. So he sort of sat on it, didn't publish anything until decades later, he heard from Alfred Russel Wallace. This gentleman had also made some observations about nature and had developed his mechanism or explanation for evolution and how it occurs. And he had known that Darwin had some ideas, again, that he'd given some talks. So he sent an unpublished copy of his manuscript to Darwin and was like, what do you think of this? Well, Darwin was like, now or never, right? It's like someone else has sort of figured out what I figured out. So he sort of hastily put things together, published it, and it was like overnight bestseller. It was a huge success. Okay. So here's a collection of some of the ideas that Darwin had put forward in his book. Okay. That everybody's different. That's one idea, is that you have populations of a different species, members of a different species, and that all these members have sort of unique combinations of characteristics. So there's variation in every population. And we know that to be the case. Even in bacteria, right? They'll have mutations that occur, and that makes them different. So in every population, there's variation. Additionally, he said some of that variation is heritable. So I jot this stuff down. That some of the variation that occurs is passed on from parent to offspring. Now, this is all pre-Mendel, right? Mendel was doing his work in the 1860s, but wasn't really understood until 1890s. So Darwin was like, something's getting passed on from parent to offspring. We understand it as DNA, right? So DNA is getting passed on. DNA produces proteins that influence traits. But again, Darwin didn't know any of that. He also said, okay, there is a competition that goes on within populations because there are limits to resources. That's the Malthus stuff, right? So with Malthus, there's competition for resources. So that's going to influence the changes in populations. All right. So from that, Darwin was able to draw some inferences. He came to some conclusions based on what he's observing. He said some members of the population have particular traits. Since there's variation in every population, some of the members have traits that make them well suited for their particular environment. Those traits that make them well suited, he referred to them as adaptations. And he said certain adaptations, certain characteristics or combinations of characteristics increase two things. This is important: odds of survival and reproduction. Okay. For something to be of value evolutionarily, not only do you need to survive, you also need to be able to reproduce. I emphasize this because there have been some FRQs in the past where they talk about fitness, and the idea of fitness is not just surviving, it's also being able to pass on those genes to the next generation. And if you don't make that point, you don't get the points on the FRQ. Okay? So some members of populations have adaptations or characteristics that make them more likely to survive and reproduce. Now, fitness, again, sometimes I think people sort of mischaracterize what Darwin meant by evolutionary fitness. Fitness is not like your bench press or your 40-yard dash time. Fitness is having the characteristics that help you survive and reproduce. Okay? So it could be things like camouflage, or it could be metabolic adaptations that allow you to swim fast in cold water. Whatever the case may be, an adaptation is something that makes you more likely to survive and reproduce. Another key idea that Darwin was able to hit upon was that it's not individuals that evolve. Individuals live or individuals die. What evolves are populations. Remember, Lamarck had this idea of individuals changing over the course of their lives and passing that on to their offspring. Man, it's not really the way that works, right? What Darwin said is, you know what? There's variation in the population. Some of the individuals survive, some don't. The survivors pass on whatever they pass on. We know they pass on genes. And so the population changes over time. So please make sure you're super clear on that. It's that populations that evolve, not individuals. And of course, over time, the population becomes better adapted to its particular environment. Okay, other big ideas from Darwin. All life shares a common ancestor. He referred to it as a tree of life. Okay? So all life comes from a common ancestor, and then he looked at it as this big branching tree where all the branches are the individual species that we see now, but you can work your way back. His mechanism for evolution was natural selection. Whereas Lamarck had this idea of acquired traits, Darwin again is like, the environment is influencing who survives and who dies. And so because of that, the population will change over time. So when nature is influencing who lives and who doesn't, that's what Darwin called natural selection. Now that change in the population, he called it descent with modification. So the idea is when you go from one generation to the next, well, the population is going to be a little different because the population is going to better reflect what's needed to survive in that particular environment. And again, Darwin made the point that populations change, not individuals. Individuals live, individuals die, individuals reproduce, individuals don't reproduce. It's the population that changes. All right. Here we're going to look at evolution as a process. What goes on to spur these changes in the population? Well, again, borrowing from Malthus, you have this idea of an overproduction of offspring. Think about in the spring where the little helicopters, those samaras, those seeds that get released from maple trees, you have huge numbers of these seeds that get released. Well, how many of them actually become full-blown trees? Or you see in the example in the image here, the little dandelion, you have all these little dandelion seeds. You can get a lot of dandelions growing in a yard, but you don't get as many mature dandelions as you do offspring. So there is this high number of offspring that are created, but there is competition for those limited resources. Okay, so again, not everybody gets to survive and reproduce. Another point, sort of going back to evolution as a process, is that there's differences in every population. Okay, all organisms are unique. So some organisms will have variations or adaptations that make them more likely to survive and reproduce. So again, over time, the population will change or evolve to better suit the demands of that particular environment. So again, that's sort of what we're getting at here. Over time, the population changes. And again, the idea of Lyell is that the Earth is old and always changing. So since the Earth is old and always changing, that gives a reason and it gives time for populations to change. So, Darwin synthesized a lot of ideas. He pulled a lot of points together to sort of make sense of what goes on with evolution. Okay, so we'll stop here. In the next clip, we'll look at evidence of evolution.